Welcome back
to Just English Talk.
We're here in the flesh. It's been too long. And welcome, of course, Eleanor.
Hi, I'm Eleanor.
It's great to have you here to talk today about poetry.
Yes.
That light topic that I'm sure we'll get to the root of in about 30 minutes, which is what we're aiming to do. We're going to do 3 episodes, I guess, one on poetry, one on prose, and one on drama.
Indeed.
And we thought we'd start here. Do you want to tell us why you thought we should start with poetry?
I think we should start with poetry because it's kind of where literature began, even prior to the invention of writing. The so-called oral tradition meant that when we, hundreds of thousands of years ago, were gathered round our fires, we were sharing oral histories, stories, ritual, law, anything that needed to be communicated, we were sharing orally. And in order to make it memorable, because we hadn't figured out how to write things down yet, we introduced kind of memorialization techniques, which became poetic techniques at a later date. So I always think of the 3 R's of rhyme, rhythm, and repetition,
which are kind of writing arithmetic.
Not that one, no.
The other
famously.
Okay. Just so that we.
Yeah. The other 3 R's, this time with poetry, the 3 R's of remembering. Rhythm, rhyme, and repetition are kind of cornerstones of poetry. And essentially, poetry came out of us wanting to remember the stories we were telling each other better. So I thought, as it's the OG literature form, before it was even considered literature, that would be a good place to start. And then we can think about drama a little bit later, and then prose even later. That kind of makes sense.
I have a question. Maybe, Eleanor, you want to start us off? Just what your first experience of poetry was, or your first kind of thoughts around poems.
I remember loving poetry earlier, possibly even than books or novels or anything, because it felt more like a puzzle than sort of the linear route of novels. And there was just so many layers to it. And when Louis were talking about the sort of the history of it, those kind of layers are immediately evident because there is a tradition of it and it's passing through all of these traditions from before writing even existed. And when you think of things like that memory and the repetition, things like the refrain just carry so much cultural weight with poetry that I think is more interesting and layered than other expressions of literature.
Nice. I've always loved poetry. It's one of those, like kind of like you, Anna, that before books I was reading poems and writing awful poems that would continue to this day because it's really hard to do. And in fact, I think there's something that always stands out to me about poetry is everybody thinks that they can write poetry and it's always god awful. And I think the more you study your poetry, the more you realize it's actually really, really hard. And I think that's actually a good thing because then you appreciate the skill a lot better. So yeah, what about you?
I was thinking about nursery rhymes.
Yes.
And I don't know why I was thinking about row, row, row your boat. But these kind of very simplistic rhyming nursery rhymes must lay some kind of foundation for why, once you get older and you start sort of stepping away from what you consider childish poetry, I guess, for children.
Yeah.
And into the more like advanced stuff or the more, emotional, broken-hearted poetry, lyrics you listen to in music and whatever it might be.
Doors.
Yeah, exactly. There must be a foundation there that, you're sung to and told these little pieces as children. It must set such a foundation for us. And I guess it comes back to what you're saying, right? About this foundational thing.
Yeah.
If you can make something rhyme, you can kind of push it to stick into people's heads.
Yeah.
And that urge we have to have children and rhymes in the same place does seem to feel not evolutionary maybe, but sort of culturally evolutionary.
Yeah. And you're kind of setting these. Even in something like row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is but a dream.
Still there.
Yeah, it's like, but even if you think about what you're saying there, it's like it's a positive message, and there's a story almost within that, and of course you later on you end up with Cummings or whoever it might be. It's kind of all a little bit out there and off the line.
Then rejecting all of those things.
Yeah, and but you have to know the form in order to then reject it, right? And I'm probably not revolutionary to say, but I'm sure all of that kind of starts in nursery rhymes.
Yeah, totally. And I think that feeds into lots of things that we talk about in the classroom, which is you need to know those forms before you can start breaking them when it comes to standard English. So we can, I think students quite often will notice that in a lot of the things that we read, they'll go, well, there's no main verb in that sentence. Why can Steinbeck do it and I can't do it?
Yeah.
Why is that allowed? And that's what it always comes down to. You need to know the forms inside out, be pretty wedded to them before you start breaking them, because it has to be. Yeah.
Break rather than the missing.
Exactly.
Yeah, you just did it by accident.
Yeah.
You know, you weren't really aware of it.
Exactly. It's kind of akin to, if you slam a basketball into the ground and it bounces up and lands in the hoop. That wasn't a demonstration of skill and kind of challenging the system of basketball. That was just a lucky bounce.
Unless you did it over and over again.
Yeah. There you go. Which is where,
Parabolic curve.
Yeah. Exactly that, yeah. So we're now going to talk about physics. So I think moving on from kind of our origins and poetry's origins, there's kind of a big question here, which is, what is poetry?
Oh, yes.
Because it's easy for us to say, as people who've been exposed to a lot of literature, to say, well, poetry is everything that isn't prose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that
Prose poem.
yeah, let's not get into that. Yeah, but I mean, I think Molière, I think. I can't remember the name of the play, but there's a scene where someone's like, I want something that isn't prose or poetry. And the response is, poetry is everything that isn't prose, and vice versa. And so it's easy for us to go, it's everything that isn't prose. But for anyone who hasn't been exposed to a ton of poetry and a ton of prose and those little exceptions that blur the boundaries, how are we going to define it?
Well, should we start by thinking about what people think poetry is, and then we can start to unpick that?
Yeah. Here's everything that it's not, and it's everything that you thought it was.
Well, if we think of the students who come into our classrooms, they have a lot of sort of preconceptions about poetry, that it rhymes, that it's about love, that it's corny or twee or sort of Hallmark card-esque. And it's very much not that. There's a rigidity to it, but there's also a lot of freedom of expression within those boundaries. I think is my starting point as I continue to negotiate. This is
exactly, and a lot of that has to do with how little they've been exposed to, right? So they can come in with. If you ask a student to write a poem, that they usually do some variation of, roses are red, violets are blue, the whole one, or acrostic poems that they've done all the way through primary school, which are not poems. I'm sorry, and
You heard it here.
Or are they?
Haikus, they're big fans of.
Love haikus.
Is the one.
Yeah. The 575.
So I guess there's a lot of what are they taught? Lower down the school.
Exactly. And so they come in and quite often, if they're kind of rejecting those basic notions there, the next step is, I'm sure it must be, was the night before Christmas. Do you know that one?
It was the night before Christmas, and all through the house.
Not a picture of stirring, even a mouse. Right. Which I think is the same as most of Dr. Seuss. Rhythmically, and the rhyme scheme and stuff. And they go in with this and they're like, I can do poetry because I've mastered this form. And they emulate that form and they're like, okay, well, that's poetry. But it's not poetry, is it? It's a specific form within poetry.
As in the Nightmare Before Christmas?
Oh, love that.
And the Night Before Christmas. It's not poetry.
It's not all of poetry.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so if we kind of do away with those basic forms and those preconceptions, and we look at it through our adult lens and we go, how do we identify poetry? What is it?
It's not continuous prose.
Ooh. Okay, why continuous?
Because it has to exist in a small moment not necessarily a moment. I mean, you can get into what I mean by that, but it's very hard to, because it's like, how do you explain something which you just kind of know within yourself, but then put into words? I had a lecturer at university called Anne Janowitz, and I remember her saying, a poem has silence above and silence below. It didn't exist, then it exists, and then it stops.
Okay.
That was her definition.
Okay, so it's something like a lyrical moment in time or something.
Yeah.
Because I think lyricism is mystery we think about.
But it was more like visually. There's a visual element, like as it...
Poetry falls, though, what it is not, the absence on the page, paragraph,
Right.
and the rigidity of a form that is distinct. Someone could see a poem compared to a piece of prose, and be able to point at which one is which.
Yeah, and for you do sometimes if you want to kind of push kids, you'll get them to like cross out all the words and just look at the shape. And there's a shape element that is, when I say continuous prose, line after line after line, paragraph break, line after line, big break, chapter. Yeah, these kind of things, which I think, make a novel and not necessarily found in poetry. At least for the kind of poems that generally, this is the thing with like prose poems and stuff. Are you really getting into that at, we're speaking largely, I guess, the GCSE A-level students.
Yeah.
What they think a poem is probably what they're going to encounter.
Yeah.
Some element of rhyme and rhythm and long lines, short lines.
Intentional choices.
Yeah.
Precisely. Lots of kind of figurative language and metaphorical writing.
Yeah, we're teasing out like the nuance, aren't we, really, here? You're absolutely right that like they will recognize a poem on sight.
Yeah.
And the sight is an important thing because of that form. I guess one of the ways of potentially distinguishing would be there's poetry, which is this kind of broad conceptual idea, which has a lot to do with kind of the deliberate language choice and the kind of the lyricism of it. And then there's verse. And they're often used interchangeably, but technically speaking, verse is what gives the rigor in terms of lineation and a lot of initial capitalization and end stopping, that kind of like the limitations on the page into verse. There's a lot more rigor in verse than the much more broad concept of poetry.
Yeah.
Because poetry, I think, again, is about the feeling,
yeah,
the feeling that goes into
capturing
it.
A feeling, capturing a moment.
Yeah.
You're talking there a little bit about convention.
Yeah.
Aren't you, I guess?
I think so. And we were speaking about this a little bit yesterday, and you said that a sonnet is all of poetry. So maybe we can think about what that could mean in terms of trying to find a way that students will have seen poetry and also what it means.
Yeah.
Okay. We say a sonnet is all of poetry.
This is Louis.
This was like, well, to be fair, if you remember, if you remember, that was a response to a line from one of your lecturers. So you've mentioned one of your lecturers. Yeah. One of your lecturers said, "A stop sign is all of poetry."
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So this kind of concept of like that lyrical contained moment, the conventions that you recognize, you can go, well, I know. If you identify the conventions of a specific poetic form, like a sonnet, then you can guarantee that this is a poem because it follows all of those conventions. What you can't then do is go, well, here's another thing that doesn't meet that form. I can't say that this therefore isn't a poem, because it might just be that I don't recognize this particular form, or indeed it's taking a Cummings approach and being formless or rejecting the forms. So how do we still know that an E.E. Cummings poem? And for those of you who haven't read any E.E. Cummings, it's not only an abandonment of kind of poetic form, but usually also of standard English and capitalization, and it's a bit kind of chaotic. Have a look and you'll see what I mean. How do we still know it's a poem is kind of the question there.
He said it was.
Yeah, he's a poet.
Yeah, he's a poet.
He identifies as a poet.
And he's these are poems. Here's my book of poems. Read them. So if you call it a poem, it is.
See, there you go. Those are
Is it looking very different from what in our heads we see as a poem? When we say the word poem, it still carries a lot of the residue and the lyricism and the musical qualities and the rhyme of a sonnet.
Yeah.
It's just presented differently as sort of the way that students often do in a starter, cut up the lines of the poem and reorganize it.
Yeah.
That's what he's doing, just in a published book as opposed to in a do now act. Did you say?
Yeah.
So all of those things are still paid to.
So if it has 40
reflect-
lines, and it's written in iambic pentameter, but then it's presented in, couple lines here, couple lines on this part of the page, to the sonnet. It's just been broken.
Yeah.
And then could I say, well, I've written here a 25-line sonnet.
But I could think about something like sort of the Brontes or Rossetti's truncated sonnets and things.
Yes. And indeed, the Shakespearean sonnet is already a development of the Petrarchan sonnet.
Yeah.
Like, there's already these variations. They're subtle, though, and I think that subtlety is kind of the key. Even if they are extreme, they're subtle in as much as you can recognize the form that they came from that has been adapted. And I think you probably have to do that. You have to see something poetic.
Yeah.
And again, it's still this nebulous concept, but you have to see something poetic in the form that has been translated. It's like one of the theories of satire as a genre is the best satire is almost indistinguishable from the thing that it's satirizing. Similar concept can be applied to people being provocative and progressive with poetic conventions, where they go, this looks enough like a poem that I can still show that I'm doing something active and often political and willful to this poetic form, because you can still recognize its origins.
Yeah.
Whereas if you completely abandon all of that and you go, like this lovely mind map that you've drawn in your notes page, is that a poem? People will go, well, probably not.
Probably not.
Because W will flashlight and said it as it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, and if this app was drawing from other pieces of poetry and just in a different format, if this was me taking the lines of a sonnet and making them into a mind map, then maybe it's not a poem in and of itself, but it's in the poetic world.
Yeah. So maybe this lends us nicely to maybe asking what questions. So if you're a student, you want to get into a poem or decide whether something is a poem or not, or even if you have something, what are the kind of questions that you should be asking initially before you go in there? So some of them we've already kind of touched on, like things like, does it rhyme? That's obviously a very simple question, but an important one because, no matter what level of English study you're at, there will be something probably to say about that. What other questions do we need to ask poems?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we're teaching unseen poetry here, we use the first acronym, the first things you look for. So the first and last line for F, any imagery, which I think is very poetic, but not necessarily verse-like. The rhyme, rhythm, repetition, the R, those are very much the kind of more verse elements, those conventions. Structure, how it's put together, and also the form and the title, because every poem that you come across is going to have all of those things, particularly if it's unseen, therefore it has to be quite short. It's going to have all of those things to identify. And I guess the question you're asking yourself in an unseen context is, what is my experience of this poem? And my experience of the poem is, well, my first impression comes from the title. Then that is either challenged or reinforced in this kind of Bordeaux. What would the adjective be of Bordeaux? Bourdieuian.
Like Bawdy.
No. Bourdieu, as in the theorist.
Oh, right.
The French. Bourdieu. This concept of expectation, like audience expectation, is generated by when you're reading and coming across art.
Gotcha.
You build this, I think, horizon of expectations. Another theorist whose name I can't remember talks about, and therefore,
like when you see the title or something, you go, that kind of sets you up for an expectation.
Exactly. And everything that you're doing is building this expectation and challenging impressions and reinforcing. And then in a broader sense, you build a sense of okay, this is a poetic form, and therefore I go in expecting certain things, which again kind of leans into that idea of when poets kind of reject those conventions.
Yeah.
But when you're experiencing a poem, it's a constant process of reevaluating and altering that impression that you got from the title, from the first line. And because it's so tightly packed and absolutely teeming with ideas, because that is poetry, I might argue, you're constantly kind of reevaluating. You can do that using first, this is how I experienced the poem. And by the end, my impression was whatever.
Nice.
And that's kind of the approach that I like to recommend certainly for unseen poetry.
Along similar lines, that's the idea of what's foregrounded, what is offered up to us as our first impression, because that it is intentional. You're absolutely right. And then is this impression reinforced or subverted?
Yeah.
And why? And we also have to think about, if we're thinking about the tradition of poetry, the audience is part of this role of what is our reaction expected to be, and is that being manipulated throughout the poem into different ways.
Yeah. That's why I kind of come back just briefly to the sonnet. That's why I think it's actually it's so useful when you say, for example, with like Ozymandias or one of these GNSE texts, when they get their head around, okay, the sonnet is a love letter, or a love poem, by nature. But then all of these poems that use the sonnet form, they're not necessarily sending this love out to like a lover. It might be to the self. It might be to nature. It might be to life in general, or heaven or hell. Any one of these things. And once an idea. So students go, oh, right. So they're taking the form.
Exactly.
And kind of messing, which is why, I guess, like, what can you see initially right there and then, like on the page, and where does that send you kind of off to?
Yeah.
You just kind of see it click. And then with unseen poetry, if they give you a sonnet, for example, it's just a really useful thing for students to be able to write about, because they can kind of say, okay, and they can bring their own creativity in. And again, it comes back to the person reading it, doesn't it? Like what they think, what they feel. What does this make you feel is a very simple question to ask yourself at the end. Problem is quite a lot of the time kids will say, I don't really feel
not at all. I haven't felt anything.
Stress on pressure. But then, put the...
What do they want their audience to feel?
Exactly. It's like that classic thing of like, oh, well, this is not funny. Okay, I know it's not funny to you, but the intention is humor. Yeah. So if it were going to be funny, hypothetically, what would make it fun?
If you did find it funny, what would you find funny? Imagine yourself in that.
Do we have any great examples or interesting examples of poems that we think kind of illustrate what we've discussed? Because I have one in my head.
Start us off.
Which is a little bit away from where we've been discussing, but I've been reading Pale Fire, recently, which is presented in 4 cantos. Now, on the surface, this is it's a novel, right? Actually, in fact, most of the story is just in footnotes to the poem. Okay, but when you read this poem, you're supposedly reading the poem of this writer. He sits down, he writes this poem, and then the novel is someone else has read this poem and giving you their interpretation. But really, it's actually very little about the poem, more about themselves. This, I think, is a good example of where poetry sort of enters into the weeds a little bit, where writers can say, well, I'm going to take the form and use it for something else entirely. So that would be my recommendation to students, to go away and read if you want something that's going to change possibly your perception of poetry.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Pale Fire. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, awesome. It's also got a lot of great pithy quotes for life in. Isn't that where we have the time is the great teacher, but unfortunately it kills all its students? I think that's in Pale Fire.
Yeah, I mean,
which is an amazing quote, but I'm sure that's in Pale Fire. Yeah, it's quoting someone else, but whatever. Yeah. But yeah, look at it. It's such a great one. But I think what's kind of really interesting there is you can... Most of what students are exposed to in terms of poetry is limited by what can fit on in an anthology or whatever, until they start studying bigger ideas. Because obviously that long narrative poem, you go, well, that's really pushing the boundaries. But also the earliest forms of poetry, if you're looking at kind of like the Iliad and the Aeneid and the Odyssey, these epics, and then Beowulf in kind of more in the Germanic tradition, then you've got these are long, sprawling narrative poems. The only thing that makes them poetic is they've got like alliteration, variation, repetition, rhythm, rhyme, etc. All of these kind of verse ideas.
Yeah.
And so you could argue that probably the oldest form of poetry is actually that narrative approach. It's only challenging the expectations of students who have been limited to this very small window, this kind of narrow remit of poems that fit on a page,
Which is
or a couple of pages.
why this is so important.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
then we're just going to sound like annoying English teachers.
Go and read more.
I won't labour that too much.
But it is true though, because like you said, students can quite often go into an exam and they'll recognise a sonnet.
Yeah.
Okay, recognize a sonnet because they've come across sonnets, and therefore they can look at like the variations in, what has been done to that form and what has been done to our expectations in terms of the love and things like that you were mentioning. They can only do that because they've been exposed to enough sonnets to recognize when things are being done interestingly with form. So the more poetry you're exposed to, the better you are at doing that kind of, ooh, this is an interesting thing, because normally from a poem like this you would expect, like, okay, so not a form thing but a genre thing, war poetry.
Yeah.
So you go into something like in the AQA anthology Exposure, right? And you're expecting, okay, we know that this poet is a famous war poet. We know that Exposure is giving that title is giving us expectations for action, right? And then nothing happens. And that's a very deliberate kind of rejection of audience expectation from the genre of war poetry that you're expecting to be grisly and full of action and people being torn apart. And they're going, actually, you know what's more horrifying? Attrition, exposure, disease, boredom, like these kind of ideas that people don't think about. And you're only able to make that interesting point because of the audience expectation. And you as an audience are only able to have that expectation if you've read a lot already.
Yeah.
So, in conclusion,
go read it.
Read more.
How about yourself?
I was just thinking while both of you were talking about rhyme, because I think that's the one thing we haven't covered as deeply, though it's one of the most noticeable things about a poem. And with audience expectation as well, once you get into a pattern of rhyme, you expect to hear the rhyme.
Yeah.
And so I think when that rhyme is not perfect, it is definitely a moment students will want to consider, because that is reason. Just like the audience expectation, you expect it to flow, and then all of a sudden you come screaming to a halt. There has to be a reason why.
Yeah.
And I think with so many of the different parts of poetry we've talked about today, we want to think about where we went back to the refrain and the fact that rhyme is a form of repetition, so that and all of the sounds, all of the words that students learn, sibilance and alliteration and all of that, are all just sounds rhyming again, and words echoing and being repeated over and over again. And that being really crucial to what poetry is. And so I was thinking of some sort of Charlotte Bronte, rigid with rhyme, except when she's not. And then you really have the power of her with her dashes and her emptiness, which speaks both to her experience as well as to the effect she was trying to create. So thinking of just the Autumn Night's Courses Run, one of those where it's just absence and fullness that speak together.
Yeah. Totally. And
maybe we'll have to do a whole episode on rhyme.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. And like, just into concepts,
like, we dip our toes in initially, get a little bit.
And I think there's no arguing that one of the things that you recognize in poetry, with that lyricism that we talked about earlier, and the kind of the very, very precise choice of language, a lot of that is for the phonology, and phonology, for those of you who don't know, is anything to do with sound in language. And so that includes alliteration, sibilance, assonance, it includes rhythm, it includes the rhyme. It's literally anything to do with the sound. Onomatopoeia, plosives, students love talking about plosives and fricatives, and all of these kind of sound-based things. Very rarely though, and I would make this point, plosive, we'll just ruin our microphones with saying those. Very rarely, though, and I think it would be worth ending on this point, very rarely do students say anything interesting when analysing phonology in poetry, because they'll go, I recognise alliteration there.
Yeah.
No idea what it's doing.
So
but
if
I've spotted
about it as repetition, then maybe it can get us further.
Totally, yeah. So there's potentially a window into talking about more interesting things in poetry, is thinking about this idea of repetition, whether it's themes, sounds, etc. And this idea of like, okay, and where am I being positioned as a reader based on my expectations, both within the poem and the reading that I've done more broadly? Two great places to start.
Nice.
Nice.
Thank you very much, peeps.
Thanks.
Have a great day.